It's late afternoon, January 30th, 1945. The air is heavy with the scent of smoke, salt water, and the dust of battle. The American soldiers, weary and weathered, stand at the threshold of a nightmare. The cries of distant gunfire echo in the background, a reminder that the war is far from over. But in this moment, they've reached something more human than military. A former Japanese prisoner camp on the outskirts of Manila, Philippines. Through the smoke and haze, the soldiers see them, thin, sunken faces, bodies skeletal from starvation, eyes hollow yet flickering with a spark of hope. These women, once captives of an unforgiving enemy, are now free. But they are not only freed from the bars of captivity, they are freed by something more: the tenderness of a gesture. As one of the soldiers approaches, he notices a young woman, trembling from the agony of untreated wounds on her hands. Without a word, he kneels beside her. His movements are careful, deliberate. He wraps her hands in bandages with a tenderness rarely seen in the brutal world they've known. For these women, the soft rustle of fabric, the pressure of a bandage, the simple act of care, is an experience they could never have imagined. For the first time in years, they are treated not as prisoners, but as human beings. By the time the first American forces made their way to the Philippines in January 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final phase. The brutal battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were still months away, but the Japanese Empire, though stubborn, was crumbling. The Allies had begun a relentless campaign to reclaim the Pacific Islands that had been seized by Japan, and with each victory, the brutality of Japanese occupation became increasingly clear. Among the most harrowing chapters of this occupation were the stories of the women who had been taken as prisoners. When Japan's military forces expanded across Southeast Asia, they had taken not only soldiers but civilians, men and women alike, as prisoners of war. But the treatment of these women was often far more degrading than that of their male counterparts. Many had been used as forced labor, subjected to horrific conditions and left to languish in unsanitary, overcrowded camps. The Japanese military viewed prisoners not as human beings but as expendable assets, and so these women endured daily violence, starvation, and inhuman treatment. In the Philippines, as the Americans began liberating areas held by the Japanese, they encountered countless survivors of these camps. The most notorious of these camps was the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, where a mixture of American and European civilians had been imprisoned. But there were others scattered across the islands, camps where women were held in equally harrowing conditions. The U.S. military had long made the treatment of prisoners a point of ethical pride. When American forces liberated prisoners, they did so with the implicit understanding that they would show them respect, offering them food, shelter, and medical care, luxuries that had been denied to the prisoners for years. But there was also something deeply symbolic in this treatment, especially for those who had been held by the Japanese. The difference between the brutal way the Japanese treated their POWs and the compassion shown by the Americans was stark. In a time when war had stripped the world of humanity, these moments of care were as significant as any military victory. The act of bandaging a hand, for example, wasn't just an act of medical care. It was a statement. In the face of barbarism, the Americans offered something profoundly different: compassion, dignity, and humanity. The soldiers who administered these acts of kindness weren't simply military men. They were symbols of a larger, idealized America, a nation built on the principles of freedom, democracy, and respect for life. They were, in essence, a living representation of the ideals the Allies were fighting for. These women, however, had no reason to believe they would be treated with such respect. After years of suffering, their expectations had been shaped by the cruelty of their captors. For them, to be seen not as victims of war but as individuals worthy of care was something they could scarcely comprehend. When they saw their hands gently bandaged by American soldiers, it was as though the long nightmare had finally ended, replaced by a moment of tenderness they had never dared imagine. The journey to this moment of compassion was long, marked by years of struggle both for the soldiers and the prisoners. By 1945, American forces had relentlessly pushed toward the Philippines as part of the larger strategy to reclaim the Pacific from Japanese control. The Philippines had been occupied by Japan since 1942, and the civilians, many of them American women, children, and the elderly, had been subject to the horrors of internment camps. The U.S. military's advance through the Philippines was a strategic necessity in the war, yet it was also in many ways a race against time. As American troops landed on the Philippine Islands in the final months of 1944, they found prisoners left to rot in increasingly dire conditions. The Japanese forces, knowing they were losing ground, had become more desperate in their treatment of the civilians they held. They had a track record of cruelty, working them to the brink of death, denying them food, medical care, and basic human dignity. In contrast, the American soldiers who liberated these camps were, in many ways, fighting not just for victory but for a vision of humanity. The ethos that defined the American military in this moment was one of duty, but also of compassion. As they liberated civilians, their mission was not solely military. It was a moral one. The military's leadership had made it clear from the outset of the Pacific War that prisoners would be treated in a manner consistent with the Geneva Conventions. Though not always perfect in execution, this policy was a direct reflection of America's ideals and values. The treatment of captured enemy soldiers was one thing, but the care of civilians, especially women and children, was a matter of much greater importance. Upon the liberation of camps like Santo Tomas, the soldiers of the U.S. Army and Navy, along with the Army Air Forces, made swift work of stabilizing the immediate needs of the survivors. At the forefront of these efforts were medical personnel, who quickly assessed the condition of the prisoners. Despite the overwhelming nature of the situation, sometimes dealing with thousands of survivors, the soldiers moved with a clear sense of purpose. They provided food, fresh water, and medical care. For the women, many of whom had been malnourished and injured, the focus was not only on basic sustenance but on restoring their humanity. One of the most significant symbols of this care was the act of bandaging wounded hands. Women who had been forced to work for the Japanese military, often doing grueling labor without gloves, had suffered severe injuries to their hands, burns, cuts, and lacerations that had gone untreated for months, if not years. For these women, to have their hands bandaged gently with no hurry and no demand for anything in return, was something that spoke louder than any words could. It was a profound statement of empathy, a recognition of their suffering, and an acknowledgement of their worth. As the soldiers moved through these camps, each small act of care, whether it was tending to a wound, offering a piece of bread, or simply speaking a few kind words, began to have an almost magical effect on the prisoners. The American military and those small but important gestures began to reverse the dehumanizing effects of war, replacing years of suffering with hope. Yet for the soldiers, this task was not always simple. While many were motivated by compassion, they too were soldiers in a brutal conflict. Their training had been focused on combat, not on offering comfort. The unexpected intimacy of their task, treating prisoners with the gentleness and respect they had never received, often brought them face to face with the emotional cost of the war. Some soldiers spoke later of the strain it caused them, how when treating the women, they were reminded not just of their own struggles but of the humanity that war so often sought to destroy. The physical and emotional scars of the women were immense. The acts of kindness shown by the Americans, though they could never fully undo the damage done, helped to bridge the vast chasm of suffering and brutality that separated them from their captors. It was in these moments that the real significance of the American military's treatment of prisoners began to crystallize. The contrast between the brutality of the Japanese regime and the compassion of the Americans was not just about the war. It was about the essence of the ideals the Allies were fighting to protect. This difference, exemplified in small yet powerful acts like bandaging hands, would resonate long after the war's end. The lives of the women who found themselves in Japanese captivity during World War II were defined by unimaginable suffering. In the Philippines and elsewhere in Asia, many had been taken from their homes, herded into makeshift prison camps, and forced into grueling labor. The Japanese military had a brutal reputation for treating prisoners as less than human, often subjecting them to forced marches, starvation, disease, and violence. Women were not spared from this cruelty. Inside the camps, they were stripped of their dignity, reduced to nothing more than laborers who existed to serve the needs of their captors. The women who survived the harsh conditions often became emaciated, their bodies weakened from months or years of malnutrition and forced labor. They were forced to work under extreme duress, whether it was unloading heavy supplies, performing manual labor, or at times being used as forced comfort women in an even darker chapter of wartime atrocity. The toll this took on their physical and mental health was staggering. The most basic human needs, food, water, medical care, were in short supply. It was not unusual for women to go days without a meal, their bodies wasting away under the scorching sun of the Philippines. Many fell ill, and without proper treatment, even minor injuries could become fatal. Some were tortured or beaten for the slightest perceived transgression, further eroding their sense of self-worth. In such an environment, hope was an elusive thing. For these women, freedom and care were distant dreams. Every day they were subjected to the same brutal routine, each moment stretching into the next, like a never-ending cycle of suffering. The thought of receiving care, of being treated with kindness, seemed an impossible fantasy, too far removed from their reality. But when the first American soldiers appeared, something started to change. The arrival of these men with their unfamiliar language, their foreign uniforms, and most importantly, their compassion, marked the beginning of something the prisoners could scarcely understand. When an American soldier knelt in front of a woman to bandage her bleeding hands, an act so simple and so human, it was the first time in years she was treated as more than a tool of war. She was seen, acknowledged, and cared for. The shock was not just from the tenderness of the act, but from the humanity it represented. In that moment, the brutal years of captivity began to melt away, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope. From the perspective of the American soldiers, the act of bandaging the hands of these women was far more than a mere medical task. It was a strategic effort to restore order and hope in a situation that had been defined by chaos. The soldiers had been trained to deal with the brutal realities of war, where the primary objective was victory. But with the liberation of prisoners, they found themselves facing an entirely different challenge, one that demanded not only tactical precision, but also an emotional intelligence that had been seldom needed on the battlefield. The military ethos emphasized the importance of treating prisoners humanely. This wasn't just about following the Geneva Conventions, although that was part of it. It was also about sending a message, both to the prisoners and to the wider world. America stood for something more than military might. Its power lay not only in the strength of its military, but in the principles it upheld. For the soldiers, many of whom had seen their fair share of combat and suffering, the sight of these frail women was a jarring reminder of the true cost of war. The act of providing medical care to them was not simply a matter of winning a battle. It was about winning back humanity. Bandaging a wound was an intimate gesture that transcended the battlefield. It symbolized a return to basic human dignity, offering these women something they had lost: care and compassion. The soldiers knew that their task was not simply to win a battle, but to restore the humanity of those they liberated. Each bandage wrapped, each woman's wound tended to, was a small but significant victory in the war, not just for land or resources, but for a lasting ideology of justice and compassion. For many soldiers, particularly those from a country that prided itself on its democratic ideals, the treatment of prisoners had moral weight. They had grown up in a society where human rights and dignity were foundational values, where the concept of individual liberty was sacred. To see these women, stripped of everything they had once known, their bodies and spirits broken, was a powerful reminder of why they fought. The American military had long prided itself on its treatment of prisoners, and the contrasting brutality of the Japanese was undeniable. In war, where humanity was often set aside in the pursuit of victory, the American soldiers knew that this mission, liberating women from the clutches of the Japanese, was as much about restoring their dignity as it was about winning the war. They were not just rescuing them from physical captivity, but from the psychological and moral abyss that war had cast them into. The simple act of bandaging a wounded hand was a symbol of a larger ethical stance, that in times of darkness, one could still choose to treat others with humanity. This moment of compassion would echo in the hearts of both the liberated and the liberators, a shared experience that would outlast the war itself. For the American soldiers, it was a reaffirmation of why they fought, not just for territory or power, but for the protection of human dignity against the forces of tyranny. The logistics of wartime care were never simple. Even as American forces advanced, they had to contend with the many obstacles of warfare: supply shortages, exhaustion, and a lack of medical equipment. However, in the chaos of war, a soldier's ingenuity and resourcefulness were often tested to their limits. The simple act of bandaging a hand required more than just medical supplies. It required careful improvisation, a kind of battlefield triage that was often more about human connection than sterile precision. The medical personnel who accompanied the advancing troops were under tremendous pressure. With the war reaching its apex, their role was not just to treat the soldiers, but also to deal with the overwhelming number of liberated prisoners, many of whom were in a far worse condition than the soldiers themselves. Yet, despite the immense challenges, American doctors, medics, and soldiers found ways to tend to the wounded. They used whatever materials they had, bandages, cloths, even torn uniforms, to stop the bleeding, dress the wounds, and offer care where none had been given for years. This makeshift approach to medical care, though born from necessity, was also deeply symbolic. It demonstrated the willingness of the Americans to extend every effort to restore the humanity of those who had suffered so greatly. In a war marked by the destruction of life, these small acts of care became powerful symbols of hope. The leadership, behind the American forces in the Pacific, had long recognized the importance of how they treated prisoners. The difference between the Japanese and American treatment of POWs became a matter of ideological significance. For American commanders, the decision to treat liberated civilians with dignity was an extension of the values they fought for. Their leadership was driven not just by a desire to defeat an enemy, but by the belief in an enduring vision for the post-war world, a world rooted in democracy, human rights, and international cooperation. At the core of this approach was General Douglas MacArthur, who, though often criticized for his ego and strategic decisions, also embodied the concept of the American way. In his famous return to the Philippines in 1944, MacArthur declared, "I have returned." This statement was symbolic, not just for the military but for the Filipino people, who had suffered under brutal Japanese occupation. MacArthur's return to the Philippines wasn't just a military victory, it was the restoration of hope and the promise of liberty. For those women in the camps, MacArthur's return meant something even more profound. It signaled the beginning of the end of their suffering. On the ground, the soldiers were often guided by an implicit understanding that how they treated the prisoners they liberated was an extension of the ideological fight. To show mercy, to offer care, was to reaffirm the righteousness of their cause. The image of American soldiers tending to wounded prisoners, treating them with kindness and respect, was not just a tactic, it was a demonstration of the ideals America stood for. This contrast was stark. On one side, the cruel and dehumanizing treatment of POWs by the Japanese. On the other, the dignified and compassionate treatment by the Americans. The act of bandaging a hand in the heat of battle was more than a gesture. It was an ideological statement about the future of the world. The simple bandage, which became so symbolically powerful in these moments of liberation, represented something profound. It was a symbol of care, of healing, of humanity in the face of horror. For the soldiers, it became a ritual, something more than just a medical procedure. It was an expression of the values they held dear. When they knelt beside a prisoner and wrapped a bandage around her hand, they weren't just providing physical care, they were restoring the idea of personal dignity, something the Japanese had taken from these women. The act of tending to wounds was a quiet but deeply significant counterpoint to the systemic violence these women had endured. It symbolized the care that democracy could offer in a world ravaged by war. It reminded both the soldiers and the prisoners of the essential truth that beneath the uniforms and the suffering, they were all human beings, bound by common needs and experiences. The symbolic weight of this act cannot be overstated. In a war where entire cities were leveled and millions of lives were lost, the act of caring for one individual, of taking the time to heal a wound, was an affirmation of life itself. It was a stark reminder that amidst the devastation of war, there could still be moments of profound humanity. For the prisoners, the psychological impact of their liberation was as significant as the physical care they received. After years of abuse, starvation, and degradation, they had learned to accept their fate. Many of them had ceased to hope for rescue, resigned to the notion that they would die in captivity. But the arrival of American forces and the subsequent acts of care were moments of profound emotional contrast. At first, many prisoners could not comprehend the kindness they were receiving. Their minds had been conditioned to expect cruelty, not mercy. When American soldiers bandaged their hands, many were overcome with disbelief, some even retreating in confusion, unable to grasp that their suffering was over. It was as though the simple act of care shattered the barriers of their trauma. For these women, the touch of an American soldier's hands on their own, no longer brutal, no longer indifferent, represented an emotional healing that was just as necessary as their physical recovery. Many of the women who were liberated later spoke of the emotional weight of this experience. They recalled that it wasn't just the bandaging of their wounds that left a lasting impression. It was the way the soldiers looked at them. There was no pity, no superiority. There was only an acknowledgement of their suffering and a recognition of their humanity. This moment of tenderness, though fleeting, marked the beginning of a psychological healing that would take years to fully unfold. For the American soldiers, too, this experience was transformative. They were used to the horrors of combat, but the act of caring for these women, of offering them the kindness they had been denied for so long, left a profound emotional mark. For many soldiers, this moment would be one of the most significant of their entire war experience, not because it marked a tactical victory, but because it affirmed the values they had been fighting for. This event, and the acts of compassion that accompanied it, left a lasting legacy in the annals of American military history. It became a defining moment for those involved, the realization that even in the darkest days of war, there could be a glimmer of hope. The care shown to the women of the Philippines was more than just a chapter in the war. It was a testament to the power of humanity, a reminder that no matter how brutal the world may become, compassion could still break through the darkness. In the years that followed the war, these acts of care and humanity were remembered and celebrated. The American soldiers who had been part of these efforts spoke of them with pride, understanding that they had helped to restore something far more valuable than just land or power. They had restored the dignity of their fellow human beings. It was January 30th, 1945, just weeks after American forces began their push through the Philippines, when the first waves of liberation reached the internment camps on Luzon Island. These camps, which had held civilians under horrific conditions for years, were about to be freed. Though no one could have fully predicted the emotional toll it would take on both the soldiers and the women they were about to rescue, the American soldiers, who had just endured the brutal conditions of the Pacific Island campaigns, approached the prison camps cautiously. They had been trained to secure and liberate, but they had never anticipated such a visceral emotional encounter. As they broke through the final barriers of the camp and entered the yard, the scene before them was more haunting than any battlefield. Women, skeletal and frail, were scattered across the compound. Their eyes, once wide with shock, were now narrowed in disbelief. For these women, freedom was an abstract idea, a distant hope that had become increasingly harder to hold on to with each passing year. But there, among the soldiers, was the first spark of humanity to shine through in years, the simple act of care. It began as a small gesture. A soldier knelt beside a woman who had been working for weeks on her hands, which were swollen and lacerated from the relentless tasks. With no regard for the overwhelming nature of the situation, he took out his supplies and began to carefully wrap her hands. It wasn't the grand gesture of a hero, but it was a simple act of kindness. And for these women, that was all it took to change everything. The sight of an American soldier kneeling before them, offering not judgment or fear, but compassion, was as remarkable as it was unexpected. These women, who had been dehumanized for so long, saw in the soldier's face the promise of a different world, It was a stark contrast to the callousness they had endured under their Japanese captors, who had seen them as tools to be exploited, not as human beings worthy of respect. For the soldier, this moment was just as powerful. He had faced the horrors of war, seen countless casualties, and been immersed in the brutalities of combat. But in the act of offering care, he realized something profound, that even in the darkest chapters of war, humanity could still emerge fragile but unbroken. As he wrapped the woman's hands, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about bandaging wounds. It was about restoring the dignity of someone who had been stripped of it for so long. The moment stretched on, as more soldiers began to tend to the wounded. The same careful, methodical approach was applied to each woman: bandages, water, food, and words of encouragement. It was clear that this wasn't just an act of physical care. It was a turning point in the war itself. While the Allies had fought for months to push the Japanese back, this moment represented the triumph of ideals that transcended military victory. It was the embodiment of what the United States was fighting for: freedom, human dignity, and the very essence of democracy. The liberated women, some of whom had been in captivity for years, had never known what it was like to be treated with such tenderness. The relief was immediate, and yet it was also deeply unsettling. For so long they had endured not just physical pain but emotional neglect. To suddenly be treated with care was a shock to their systems, leaving many of them in tears, unable to process the sudden change in their fate. In those moments of bandaging hands and offering food, a barrier was broken. But it wasn't just the physical act of care that was profound. It was the recognition that these women, who had been crushed under the weight of war, still had the capacity to heal. With every bandage wrapped, every hand held, they were not just receiving treatment, they were reclaiming their humanity. This turning point marked not just the end of their captivity, but the beginning of a journey toward recovery. One that would take years, but one that had started with a simple act of compassion. For the soldiers, this was a moment of realization. As they continued their mission to secure and liberate, they were faced with a new understanding of the war. They weren't just fighting for military victory, they were fighting for something much greater, something that had been lost in the devastation of conflict, the preservation of human dignity. As the last barriers of the internment camp were removed, the full scale of the soldiers' impact began to resonate. The American soldiers, still reeling from the intensity of battle, found themselves in an unexpected role: bearers of compassion. The intensity of their mission shifted from the tactical and strategic concerns of war to something far more human. Every action they took to help the prisoners was an emotional moment that stretched far beyond the mission at hand. Among the women, there were those who had been in the camps for several years, survivors of the brutalities of forced labor, malnutrition, and physical abuse. Yet despite their skeletal frames, their hollow eyes, and their trembling hands, they remained resilient. They were not just women. Though their bodies were frail, their spirits had endured in silence. When the soldiers entered, many of them could hardly believe it. The long years of suffering, the years spent living in a limbo between life and death, had dulled their sense of hope. To them, the idea of being liberated had become a mere fantasy. Now, as they looked upon the soldiers who arrived with gentle hands and tender hearts, they realized that their freedom, once an unreachable dream, was now a reality. The act of bandaging the women's hands, simple though it seemed, became a pivotal moment in their liberation. It was not just the physical relief that the women experienced, but the profound emotional release. These were the hands that had been calloused by years of forced labor. They had been the hands that had been slapped, burned, and used as tools of survival in the brutal world of internment. Now they were being handled with care, their wounds cleansed and their dignity restored. The soldiers, though weary from battle, treated these hands as though they were the most valuable thing in the world. It was an act of restoration. For many of the women, this was a moment of disbelief. The pain they had endured, the cruelty of their captors, the degradation they had suffered, suddenly it was as though a wall had been broken. The contrast was too much for some to bear, and tears filled their eyes. Some wept silently, while others could not contain the flood of emotions that had built up over the years. After years of being viewed as less than human, they were now being treated with the utmost respect. It was a feeling they could hardly comprehend. The tenderness shown by these soldiers was, for many, a gift beyond measure. It was the first real act of kindness they had experienced in so long that they struggled to reconcile it with the nightmare they had lived through. For the soldiers themselves, this moment was equally transformative. They had been trained to kill, to fight, to win. They had seen death up close, felt the weight of combat, and understood the cruelty of war. But nothing had prepared them for this. Nothing had prepared them for the emotional weight of liberating prisoners who had been so cruelly mistreated. As each soldier knelt down to bandage the hands of these women, there was a silent understanding among them. They weren't just fighting to defeat an enemy. They were fighting for something much larger. The care they provided was not just for the bodies of the women, but for their spirits as well. In the simplicity of wrapping a bandage around a wounded hand, they were offering not just physical healing, but a symbol of hope. This was not just a military victory. It was a moment of healing for both the liberators and the liberated. The turning point was not marked by the dramatic surge of troops or the capture of a strategic position. It was defined by the quiet, almost sacred moments of care that unfolded within the walls of these internment camps. The soldiers who had seen so much suffering became witnesses to something they had longed to see: the restoration of dignity, the reclaiming of humanity. The simple act of bandaging hands, as mundane as it might have seemed in the broader context of war, was a profound declaration. It was the affirmation that the war they were fighting was not only for victory in battle, but for the very soul of humanity. As the camp began to settle into a new reality, with the prisoners being cared for and nourished, the full weight of what had occurred began to sink in. The liberation was not just a tactical success. It was a deeply personal victory for both the American soldiers and the women they had rescued. For the women, the brutal reality of the war was replaced by a future where they could heal, rebuild, and reclaim their lives. For the soldiers, it was a reminder of why they fought, not for power, not for glory, but for something more: the preservation of life, the restoration of dignity, and the reaffirmation of the values that made their nation what it was. This moment, marked by the act of carefully bandaging a hand, was more than a simple gesture. It became a defining symbol of the war's end, a return to compassion, to humanity, to hope. It was a pivotal moment in the Pacific Campaign, not just for the soldiers who fought, but for the women who had suffered and survived. The war had taken so much from them, but in the act of liberation they regained something far more precious, something no enemy could ever take away. As the dust settled over the liberated camps, the full consequences of the American intervention began to take shape. For the women who had endured years of brutality, the physical recovery was an immediate priority. The soldiers, who had been focused on warfare and survival, now found themselves immersed in the task of rehabilitation. Medical personnel, many of whom had faced combat trauma themselves, worked tirelessly to stabilize the prisoners. In some cases, they were forced to make do with limited supplies, improvising with what they had: bandages made from torn uniforms, water sourced from nearby streams, and whatever medical equipment they could scrounge from the soldiers' reserves. But even amidst the scarcity, there was a prevailing sense of relief. The women who had been left to rot in the camps, emaciated and broken, were receiving the most basic care for the first time in years. The immediate care, food, water, medical treatment, was essential to their survival. For some, it was a battle against death itself. Malnutrition had weakened their bodies, and many suffered from diseases that had been ignored for far too long. The Japanese had been indifferent to their suffering, and now for the first time these women were receiving the kind of attention that was owed to every human being. It was not a perfect cure, but it was a starting point. The process of healing, both physical and emotional, was slow, but it had begun. For the American soldiers, the aftermath was equally challenging. They had entered the camps as liberators, but they were now faced with the practical realities of helping the women recover. There were no easy solutions, no quick fixes. Many of the soldiers who had tended to the women's wounds had never been trained for such work. The emotional strain of caring for the liberated prisoners weighed heavily on them. Some soldiers later recounted the overwhelming sense of helplessness they felt, knowing that no matter how much they gave, the women would carry the scars of their captivity for the rest of their lives. For many of the women, however, The initial shock of liberation was followed by a profound sense of gratitude. They had been treated as less than human for so long that they could scarcely believe they were free. The simple act of care, of being seen, of being touched gently, became a powerful symbol of their newfound freedom. The soldiers' hands, which had bandaged their wounds, had also helped to reclaim their humanity. While the immediate aftermath focused on physical recovery, the psychological toll was far more difficult to address. The years of brutality, the constant threat of death, and the emotional scars left by their captors could not be undone with food or medicine. Some women struggled to cope with the loss of their former lives, while others found it impossible to speak of their experiences. Many of the soldiers, too, had their own emotional burdens to bear. They had witnessed suffering, but caring for the survivors in this intimate, personal way left them profoundly affected. The emotional bond between the liberators and the liberated would linger long after the war ended, leaving an indelible mark on both. Yet, despite the overwhelming challenges, there was a sense of progress. The American soldiers had not only liberated the women from physical captivity, but had helped to restore something far more important: their dignity. It was not just the food and medical care that mattered, it was the acknowledgement of their humanity. In this moment of relief, the women began to reclaim their place in the world, a world that had once turned its back on them. The broader consequences of this liberation rippled through the Pacific theater as well. In the days and weeks that followed, American forces continued to liberate more prisoners in the Philippines and beyond. The military's commitment to the ethical treatment of POWs and civilians became a defining characteristic of the Allied campaign, one that was remembered in the post-war years as a crucial part of the narrative of victory. The Japanese, in contrast, would be remembered for their systematic mistreatment of prisoners, a stark reminder of the brutalities of their empire. For the American soldiers involved in these liberations, the experience left a deep and lasting impression. Many spoke of the moments they spent with the women in the camps as some of the most significant of their entire military careers. They had witnessed the worst of humanity, but they had also seen the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. The emotional transformation these soldiers experienced was profound. They had entered the war with a sense of duty, but they left with something more: an understanding of the true cost of war and the importance of preserving human dignity, even in the darkest of times. In the weeks following the liberation, as the initial rush of medical aid began to subside, the true long-term effects of the experience began to unfold. For the women, the act of being treated with care by the American soldiers was only the first step in a complex journey toward recovery. While the immediate needs, food, water, and medical care, were addressed, the emotional and psychological scars they carried would remain much longer. The women who had survived the camps faced not only the challenge of physical rehabilitation, but the arduous task of regaining their sense of self-worth. Many of the women were haunted by what they had endured in the years of captivity. The brutality of their treatment under the Japanese had left a lasting imprint on their psyches. Some had been isolated for so long that they found it difficult to trust anyone, even the soldiers who had come to their aid. Others struggled with the loss of their families, many of whom had either perished in the camps or been lost during the course of the war. The emotional weight of these experiences often manifested in survivors' guilt, depression, and a deep sense of loss that no amount of medical care could heal. Yet, despite these challenges, the act of liberation marked the beginning of a new chapter. Slowly, the women began to rebuild their lives. The care they received from the American soldiers was not a panacea. It did not erase the years of suffering, nor could it undo the trauma they had endured. But it was a vital first step. The kindness shown to them, the recognition of their humanity, became a foundation upon which they could start to heal. The women were not just surviving, they were, in the truest sense of the word, being restored. For the soldiers, the aftermath was similarly complex. They had entered the camps as warriors, focused on the mission at hand, but they left with a far greater understanding of the cost of war. They had been trained to fight to secure victories, but nothing had prepared them for the emotional toll of liberating civilians who had suffered so grievously. The physical scars on the women were easy to see: the malnourished bodies, the battered hands, the hollow eyes. But the invisible scars, the emotional trauma, the broken spirits, were more difficult to comprehend. In the days and months that followed the liberation, Many soldiers recalled how the experiences in the camp stayed with them long after they returned to the front lines. Some struggled to reconcile the violence they had witnessed with the gentleness they had shown to the women. The men who had bandaged the women's hands, who had offered them food and care, were changed by the experience. They had not only witnessed the horrors of war, but had participated in an act of compassion that would shape their view of humanity forever. The long-term impact of this event extended far beyond the immediate relief provided to the prisoners. The stories of the American soldiers' treatment of the women spread through the ranks. It became a defining moment in the war, one that exemplified the ideals that the Allies were fighting for. It was not simply a military victory. It was a moral victory. The idea that soldiers could not only fight for freedom, but also demonstrate compassion in the midst of war, was a powerful message. It set a precedent for how the American military would approach the treatment of prisoners and civilians in the years that followed. In the years following the war, the stories of the women liberated in the Philippines were told as part of the broader narrative of Allied victory. These women, who had once been imprisoned, starved, and brutalized, had become symbols of the strength of the human spirit. Their liberation and the care they received stood as a testament to the resilience of the human will and to the compassion that could arise in the most dire of circumstances. The American soldiers who had been a part of these moments of care were likewise remembered not just for their combat prowess, but for their humanity. They had fought for freedom and won, but they had also fought to restore what war had taken from the women: dignity, hope, and a chance at life. This act of liberation, this moment when American soldiers knelt to bandage the hands of women who had suffered so greatly, left a legacy. It was a reminder that even in the midst of the chaos and devastation of war, there were moments when humanity could still triumph. These small but powerful acts of kindness did not change the course of the war. They did not win battles or shift strategies. But they did something far more lasting. They reminded the world that, despite the darkness of conflict, there remained the possibility for light. The transformation of these women from prisoners to survivors, and of soldiers from combatants to caretakers, was a poignant chapter in the broader story of World War II. It was a chapter that spoke not just to the cost of war, but to the power of compassion, the ability of human beings to reach out to one another, even in the darkest of times, and to restore what war had tried to destroy. The act of bandaging a hand, simple though it may seem, carries with it a weight far beyond the moment it occurred. In the vast expanse of World War II, amid the battles fought on distant shores, there are few moments that so clearly embody the contrast between humanity and inhumanity, cruelty and compassion. When American soldiers knelt to tend to the hands of the women they liberated from the camps in the Philippines, they were not simply offering medical care. They were offering a glimpse of a future defined not by the suffering of war, but by the healing power of human connection. In this moment of tenderness, the brutality of the war was momentarily set aside. The soldiers, who had spent so many months entrenched in the violence of battle, were faced with a profound realization. In the end, it was not just the physical victory over an enemy that mattered, but the ability to restore dignity to those whose humanity had been stripped away. The women, who had lived through unimaginable hardship, saw in those simple bandages not just the alleviation of pain, but a return to what they had lost: their worth, their identity, their very personhood. For them, this act of care was the first step toward healing, a healing that would take years, but which had begun with a single act of compassion. The story of these women, and the soldiers who liberated them, is a testament to the enduring power of compassion in the face of evil. It stands as a stark reminder that, even in the darkest times, the values of freedom, humanity, and dignity can survive. It was not just the American military might that brought victory. It was the simple, powerful act of caring for those who had suffered the most. In a world ravaged by war, these moments of kindness were the antidote to the dehumanizing forces that sought to tear it apart. And for the soldiers who took part in this act of liberation, the experience would forever change the way they viewed the world. They had seen war in all its forms: death, destruction, and the ugliness of human conflict. But in this moment they witnessed something else: the profound power of human decency. They had been fighting for more than just military victory. They had been fighting for a world where such acts of kindness could exist. The bandaging, of a hand became a symbol of the greater victory fought not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who believed that, despite the horrors of war, there was always hope for restoration. It reminded everyone involved that in the end, it was not just victory over an enemy that defined the outcome of war. It was the ability to restore and redeem the lives torn apart by conflict. As the years passed and the war came to an end, this story, like so many others, became a part of the fabric of history. The women who had been freed would go on to rebuild their lives, their hands now healed, serving as a silent testament to their resilience. And the soldiers, too, would carry with them the memory of that moment, when they could offer something more than military might, something truly human. In their hearts, they would know that the ultimate victory was not the defeat of an enemy, but the affirmation of the values that made them who they were, values rooted in freedom, dignity, and compassion. In a world that so often turns to violence to resolve its differences, the memory of those bandaged hands reminds us that there is always a choice, always the possibility for compassion, for restoration, and for healing. And it is in these moments of tenderness and the small acts of humanity that arise amidst the chaos of war that the true nature of freedom is revealed. The greatest battles may be won with weapons, but the deepest victories are won with compassion. This is the legacy left by those who knelt to bandage the hands of the women they freed, a legacy of kindness, of care, and of the enduring power of human connection in a broken world.